2 or 3 of the fruit, but to our chagrin they proved to be much decayed, the rinds partly opened by the birds, and their hearts half devoured. However, we quickly dispatched them, and no ambrosia could have been more delicious. We looked about us, uncertain whither to direct our steps, since the path we had so far followed appeared to be lost in the open space around us. At last we resolved to enter a grove near at hand, and had advanced a few rods when, just upon its skirts, I picked up a slender breadfruit shoot perfectly green, and with the tender bark freshly stripped from it, it was still slippery with moisture, and appeared as if it had been but that moment thrown aside. I said nothing, but merely held it up to Toby, who started at this undeniable evidence of the vicinity of the savages. The plot was now thickening. A short distance further lay a little faggot of the same shoots bound together with a strip of bark. Could it have been thrown down by some solitary native who, alarmed at seeing us, had hurried forward to carry the tidings of our approach to his countrymen, Typee or Happer? But it was too late to recede, so we moved on slowly, my companion, in advance, casting eager glances under the trees on each side, until all at once I saw him recoil as if stung by an adder. Sinking on his knee, he waved me off with one hand, while with the other he held aside some intervening leaves and gazed intently at some object. Disregarding his injunction, I quickly approached him, and caught a glimpse of 2 figures partly hidden by the dense foliage. They were standing close together, and were perfectly motionless. They must have previously perceived us, and withdrawn into the depths of the wood to elude our observation. My mind was at once made up. Dropping my staff, and tearing open the package of things we had brought from the ship, I unrolled the cotton cloth, and holding it in one hand, picked with the other a twig from the bushes beside me, and telling Toby to follow my example, I broke through the covert and advanced, waving the branch in token of peace towards the shrinking forms before me. They were a boy and a girl, slender and graceful and completely naked, with the exception of a slight girdle of bark from which depended an opposite points 2 of the russet leaves of the breadfruit tree. An arm of the boy, half screened from sight by her wild tresses, was thrown about the neck of the girl, while the other he held one of her hands in his, and thus they stood together, their heads inclined forward, catching the faint noise we made in our progress, and with one foot in advance, as it half inclined to fly from our presence. As we drew near, their alarm evidently increased. Apprehensive that they might fly from us altogether, I stopped short and motioned them to advance and receive the gift I extended towards them, but they would not. I then uttered a few words of their language, with which I was acquainted, scarcely expected that they would understand me, but to show that we had not dropped from the clouds upon them. This appeared to give them a little confidence, so I approached nearer, presenting the cloth with one hand and holding the bough with the other, while they slowly retreated. At last they suffered us to approach so near to them that we were unable to throw the cotton cloth across their shoulders, giving them to understand that it was theirs, and by a variety of gestures endeavouring to make them understand that we entertained the highest possible regard for them. The frightened pair now stood still, whilst we endeavoured to make them comprehend the nature of our wants. In doing this, Toby went through with a complete series of pantomimic illustrations, opening his mouth from ear to ear, and thrusting his fingers down his throat, gnashing his teeth, and rolling his eyes about, till I verily believe the poor creatures took us for a couple of white cannibals who were about to make a meal of them. When, however, they understood us, they showed no inclination to relieve our wants. At this juncture it began to rain violently, and we motioned them to lead us to some place of shelter. With this request they appeared willingly to comply, but nothing could evince more strongly the apprehension with which they regarded us, than the way in which, whilst walking before us, they kept their eyes constantly turned back to watch every movement we made, and even our very looks. "Typee or Hapar, Toby?" asked I, as we walked after them. "Of course, Hapar," he replied, with a show of confidence which was intended to disguise his doubts. "We shall soon know," I exclaimed, and at the same moment I stepped forward towards our guides, and pronouncing the two names interrogatively and pointing to the lowest part of the valley, endeavoured to come to the point at once. They repeated the words after me again and again, but without giving any peculiar emphasis to either, so that I was completely at a loss to understand them. For a couple of wilier young things than we afterwards found them to have been on this particular occasion never probably fell in any traveller's way. More and more curious to ascertain our fate, I now threw together in the form of a question the words Hapa and Motaki, the latter being equivalent to the word good. The two natives interchanged glances of peculiar meaning with one another at this, and manifested no little surprise. But on the repetition of the question, after some consultation together, to the great joy of Toby, they answered in the affirmative. Toby was now in ecstasies, especially as the young savages continued to reiterate their answer with great energy, as though desirous of impressing us with the idea that being among the Hapas we ought to consider ourselves perfectly secure. Although I had some lingering doubts, I feigned great delight with Toby at this announcement, while my companion broke out into a pantomimic abhorrence of Typee, and immeasurable love for the particular valley in which we were, our guides all the while gazing uneasily at one another as if at a loss to account for our conduct. They hurried on, and we followed them, until suddenly they set up a strange halloo, which was answered from beyond the grove through which we were passing, and the next moment we entered upon some open ground, at the extremity of which we descried a long, low hut, and in front of it were several young girls. As soon as they perceived us, they fled with wild screams into the adjoining thickets, like so many startled fawns. A few moments after, the whole valley resounded with savage outcries, and the natives came running towards us from every direction. Had an army of invaders made an irruption into their territory, they could not have evinced greater excitement. We were soon completely encircled by a dense throng, and in their eager desire to behold us, they almost arrested our progress. An equal number surrounded our youthful guides, who, with amazing volubility, appeared to be detailing the circumstances which had attended their meeting with us. Every item of intelligence appeared to redouble the astonishment of the islanders, and they gazed at us with inquiring looks. At last we reached a large and handsome building of bamboos, and were by signs told to enter it, the natives opening a lane for us through which to pass. On entering without ceremony, we threw our exhausted frames upon the mats that covered the floor. In a moment, the slight tenement was completely full of people, whilst those who were unable to obtain admittance gazed at us through its open canework. It was now evening, and by the dim light we could just discern the savage countenances around us, gleaming with wild curiosity and wonder, the naked forms and tattooed limbs of the brawny warriors, with here and there the slighter figures of young girls, all engaged in a perfect storm of conversation, of which we were, of course, the only theme, whilst our recent guides were fully occupied in answering the innumerable questions which everyone put to them. Nothing can exceed the fierce gesticulation of these people when animated in conversation, and on this occasion they gave loose to all their natural vivacity, shouting and dancing about in a manner that well nigh intimidated us. Close to where we lay, squatted upon their haunches, were some 8 or 10 noble-looking chiefs, for such they were subsequently proved to be, who, more reserved than the rest, regarded us with a fixed and stern attention, which not a little discomposed our equanimity. One of them in particular, who appeared to be the highest in rank, placed himself directly facing me, looking at me with a rigidity of aspect under which I absolutely quailed. He never once opened his lips, but maintained his severe expression of countenance, without turning his face aside for a single moment. Never before had I been subjected to so strange and steady a glance. It revealed nothing of the mind of the savage, but it appeared to be reading my own. After undergoing this scrutiny till I grew absolutely nervous, with a view of diverting it if possible, and conciliating the good opinion of the warrior, I took some tobacco from the bosom of my frock and offered it to him. He quietly rejected the proffered gift, and, without speaking, motioned me to return it to its place. In my previous intercourse with the natives of Nukuhava and Tior, I had found that the present of a small piece of tobacco would have rendered any of them devoted to my service. Was this act of the chief a token of his enmity, Typee, or Hapa? I asked within myself. I started, for at the same moment this identical question was asked by the strange being before me. I turned to Toby. The flickering light of a native tapper showed me his countenance pale with trepidation at this fatal question. I paused for a second, and I know not by what impulse it was that I answered Typee. The piece of dusky statuary nodded in approval, and then murmured, "Motaki." "Motaki," said I, without further hesitation. "Typee, Motaki?" What a transition! The dark figures around us leaped to their feet, clapped their hands in transport, and shouted again and again the talismanic syllables, the utterance of which appeared to have settled everything. When this commotion had a little subsided, the principal chief squatted once more before me, and, throwing himself into a sudden rage, poured forth a string of philippics, which I was at no loss to understand, from the frequent recurrence of the word Hapa as being directed against the natives of the adjoining valley. In all these denunciations, my companion and I acquiesced while we extolled the character of the warlike Typees. To be sure, our panegyrics were somewhat laconic, consisting in the repetition of that name, united with the potent adjective Motaki. But this was sufficient and served to conciliate the good will of the natives, with whom our congeniality of sentiment on this point did more towards inspiring a friendly feeling than anything else that could have happened. At last the wrath of the chief evaporated, and in a few moments he was as placid as ever. Laying his hand upon his breast, he gave me to understand that his name was Mehevi, and that in return he wished me to communicate my appellation. I hesitated for an instant, thinking that it might be difficult for him to pronounce my real name, and then, with the most praiseworthy intentions, intimated that I was known as Tom. But I could not have made a worse selection. The chief could not master it. Tommo, Tomma, Tommi, everything but plain Tom. As he persisted in garnishing the word with an additional syllable, I compromised the matter with him at the word Tommo, and by that name I went during the entire period of my stay in the valley. The same proceeding was gone through with Toby, whose mellifluous appellation was more easily caught. An exchange of names is equivalent to a ratification of goodwill and amity among these simple people, and as we were aware of this fact, we were delighted that it had taken place on the present occasion. Reclining upon our mats, we now held a kind of levee, giving audience to successive troops of the natives, who introduced themselves to us by pronouncing their respective names, and retired in high good humour on receiving ours in return. During this ceremony, the greatest merriment prevailed, nearly every announcement on the part of the islanders being followed by a fresh sally of gaiety, which induced me to believe that some of them, at least, were innocently diverting the company at our expense by bestowing upon themselves a string of absurd titles, of the humour of which we were, of course, entirely ignorant. All this occupied about an hour, when the throng having a little diminished, I turned to Mehevi and gave him to understand that we were in need of food and sleep. Immediately the attentive chief addressed a few words to one of the crowd, who disappeared and returned in a few moments with a calabash of poe, and 2 or 3 young coconuts stripped of their husks and with their shells partly broken. We both of us forthwith placed one of these natural goblets to our lips, and drained it in a moment of the refreshing draught it contained. The poe was then placed before us, and even famished as I was, I paused to consider in what manner to convey it to my mouth. This staple article of food among the Marquesas Islanders is manufactured from the produce of the breadfruit tree. It somewhat resembles in its plastic nature a bookbinder's paste, is of a yellow colour and somewhat tart to the taste. Such was the dish, the merits of which I was now eager to discuss. I eyed it wistfully for a moment, and then, unable any longer to stand on ceremony, plunged my hand into the yielding mass, and to the boisterous mirth of the natives, drew it forth laden with the poe, which adhered in lengthy strings to every finger. So stubborn was its consistency that in conveying my heavily weighted hand to my mouth, the connecting links almost raised the calabash from the mats on which it had been placed. This display of awkwardness, in which, by the by, Toby kept me company, convulsed the bystanders with uncontrollable laughter. As soon as their merriment had somewhat subsided, Mehevi, motioning us to be attentive, dipped the forefinger of his right hand in the dish, and, giving it a rapid and scientific twirl, drew it out coated smoothly with the preparation. With a second peculiar flourish, he prevented the poe from dropping to the ground as he raised it to his mouth, into which the finger was inserted and drawn forth perfectly free from any adhesive matter. This performance was evidently intended for our instruction, so I again essayed the feat on the principles inculcated, but with very ill success. A starving man, however, little heeds conventional proprieties, especially on a South Sea island, and accordingly Toby and I partook of the dish after our own clumsy fashion, beplastering our faces all over with the glutinous compound, and daubing our hands nearly to the wrist. This kind of food is by no means disagreeable to the palate of a European, though at first the mode of eating it may be. For my own part, after the lapse of a few days, I became accustomed to its singular flavour and grew remarkably fond of it. So much for the first course. Several other dishes followed it, some of which were positively delicious. We concluded our banquet by tossing off the contents of 2 more young coconuts, after which we regaled ourselves with the soothing fumes of tobacco, inhaled from a quaintly carved pipe which passed round the circle. During the repast, the natives eyed us with intense curiosity, observing our minutest motions, and appearing to discover abundant matter for comment in the most trifling occurrence. Their surprise mounted the highest when we began to remove our uncomfortable garments, which were saturated with rain. They scanned the whiteness of our limbs and seemed utterly unable to account for the contrast they presented to the swarthy hue of our faces, embrowned from a 6 months' exposure to the scorching sun of the line. They felt our skin, much in the same way that a silk mercer would handle a remarkably fine piece of satin, and some of them went so far in their investigation as to apply the olfactory organ. Their singular behaviour almost led me to imagine that they never before had beheld a white man, but a few moments' reflection convinced me that this could not have been the case, and a more satisfactory reason for their conduct has since suggested itself to my mind. Deterred by the frightful stories related of its inhabitants, ships never enter this bay, while their hostile relations with the tribes in the adjoining valleys prevent the Typees from visiting that section of the island where vessels occasionally lie. At long intervals, however, some intrepid captain will touch on the skirts of the bay, with 2 or 3 armed boats' crews and accompanied by interpreters. The natives who live near the sea descry the strangers long before they reach their waters, and, aware of the purpose for which they come, proclaim loudly the news of their approach. By a species of vocal telegraph, the intelligence reaches the inmost recesses of the vale in an inconceivably short space of time, drawing nearly its whole population down to the beach laden with every variety of fruit. The interpreter, who is invariably a tabooed Kanaka, leaps ashore with the goods intended for barter, while the boats, with their oars shipped and every man on his thwart, lie just outside the surf, heading off the shore in readiness at the first untoward event to escape to the open sea. As soon as the traffic is concluded, one of the boats pulls in under cover of the muskets of the others. The fruit is quickly thrown into her, and the transient visitors precipitately retire from what they justly consider so dangerous a vicinity. The word Kanaka is at the present day universally used in the South Seas by Europeans to designate the islanders. In the various dialects of the principal groups, it is simply a sexual designation applied to the males, but it is now used by the natives in their intercourse with foreigners in the same sense in which the latter employ it. A tabooed Kanaka is an islander whose person has been made to a certain extent sacred by the operation of a singular custom, hereafter to be explained. The intercourse occurring with Europeans being so restricted, no wonder that the inhabitants of the valley manifested so much curiosity with regard to us, appearing as we did among them under such singular circumstances. I have no doubt that we were the first white men who ever penetrated thus far back into their territories, or at least the first who had ever descended from the head of the veil. What had brought us thither must have appeared a complete mystery to them, and from our ignorance of the language it was impossible for us to enlighten them. In answer to their inquiries, which the eloquence of their gestures enabled us to comprehend, all that we could reply was that we had come from Nukuheva, a place, be it remembered, with which they were at open war. This intelligence appeared to affect them with the most lively emotions. "Nukuheva, Muotaki?" they asked. "Of course," we replied, most energetically in the negative. Then they plied us with 1,000 questions, of which we could understand nothing more than that they had reference to the recent movements of the French, against whom they seemed to cherish the most fierce hatred. So eager were they to obtain information on this point that they still continued to propound their queries long after we had shown that we were utterly unable to answer them. Occasionally we caught some indistinct idea of their meaning, when we would endeavour by every method in our power to communicate the desired intelligence. At such times their gratification was boundless, and they would redouble their efforts to make us comprehend them more perfectly. But all in vain, and in the end they looked at us despairingly, as if we were the receptacles of invaluable information, but how to come at it they knew not. After a while the group around us gradually dispersed, and we were left about midnight, as we conjectured, with those who appeared to be permanent residents of the house. These individuals now provided us with fresh mats to lie upon, covered us with several folds of tapa, and then, extinguishing the tapers that had been burning, threw themselves down beside us, and after a little desultory conversation was soon sound asleep. Chapter 11. Midnight Reflections. Morning Visitors. A Warrior in Costume. A Savage Aesculapius. Practice of the Healing Art. Body Servant. A Dwelling House of the Valley Described. Portraits of its Inmates. Various and conflicting were the thoughts which oppressed me during the silent hours that followed the events related in the preceding chapter. Toby, wearied with the fatigues of the day, slumbered heavily by my side, but the pain under which I was suffering effectually prevented my sleeping, and I remained distressingly alive to all the fearful circumstances of our present situation. Was it possible that, after all our vicissitudes, we were really in the terrible valley of Typee, and at the mercy of its inmates, a fierce and unrelenting tribe of savages? Typee or Hapa? I shuddered when I reflected that there was no longer any room for doubt, and that beyond all hope of escape we were now placed in those very circumstances from the bare thought of which I had recoiled with such abhorrence but a few days before. What might not be our fearful destiny? To be sure, as yet we had been treated with no violence, nay, had been even kindly and hospitably entertained. But what dependence could be placed upon the fickle passions which sway the bosom of a savage? His inconsistency and treachery are proverbial. Might it not be that beneath these fair appearances the islanders covered some perfidious design, and that their friendly reception of us might only precede some horrible catastrophe? How strongly did these forebodings spring up in my mind as I lay restlessly upon a couch of mats surrounded by the dimly revealed forms of those whom I so greatly dreaded. From the excitement of these fearful thoughts, I sank towards morning in an uneasy slumber, and, on awakening with a start, in the midst of an appalling dream, looked upon into the eager countenance of a number of the natives, who were bending over me. It was broad day, and the house was nearly filled with young females, fancifully decorated with flowers, who gazed upon me as I rose with faces in which childish delight and curiosity were vividly portrayed. After waking Toby, they seated themselves round us on the mats, and gave full play to that prying inquisitiveness which, time out of mind, has been attributed to the adorable sex. As these unsophisticated young creatures were attended by no jealous duennas, their proceedings were altogether informal, and void of artificial restraint. Long and minute was the investigation with which they honoured us, and so uproarious their mirth that I felt infinitively sheepish, and Toby was immeasurably outraged at their familiarity. These lively young ladies were at the same time wonderfully polite and humane, fanning aside the insects that occasionally lighted on our brows, presenting us with food, and compassionately regarding me in the midst of my afflictions. But in spite of all their blandishments, my feelings of propriety were exceedingly shocked, for I could but consider them as having overstepped the due limits of female decorum. Having diverted themselves to their heart's content, our young visitants now withdrew, and gave place to successive troops of the other sex, who continued flocking towards the house until near noon, by which time I have no doubt that the greater part of the inhabitants of the valley had bathed themselves in the light of our benignant countenances. At last, when their numbers began to diminish, a superb-looking warrior stooped the towering plumes of his headdress beneath the low portal, and entered the house. I saw at once that he was some distinguished personage, the natives regarding him with the utmost deference, and making room for him as he approached. His aspect was imposing. The splendid, long drooping tail feathers of the tropical bird, thickly interspersed with the gaudy plumage of the cock, were disposed in an immense upright semicircle upon his head, their lower extremities being fixed in a crescent of guinea heads, which spanned the forehead. Around his neck were several enormous necklaces of boar's tusks, polished like ivory, and disposed in such a manner as that the longest and largest were upon his capacious chest. Thrust forward through the large apertures in his ears were two small and finely shaped sperm whale teeth, presenting their cavities in front, stuffed with freshly plucked leaves and curiously wrought at the other end into strange little images and devices. These barbaric trinkets, garnished in this manner at their open extremities, and tapering and curving round to a point behind the ear, resembled not a little a pair of cornucopias. The loins of the warrior were girt about with heavy folds of a dark-coloured tappa, hanging before and behind in clusters of braided tassels, while anklets and bracelets of curling human hair completed his unique costume. In his right hand he grasped a beautifully carved paddle spear, nearly 15 feet in length, made of the bright core wood, one end sharply pointed and the other flattened like an oar blade, hanging obliquely from his girdle by a loop of sinnate was a richly decorated pipe. The slender reed forming its stern was coloured with a red pigment, and round it, as well as the idle bowl, fluttered little streamers of the thinnest tapper. But that which was most remarkable in the appearance of this splendid islander was the elaborate tattooing displayed on every noble limb. All imaginable lines and curves and figures were delineated over his whole body, and in their grotesque variety and infinite profusion, I could only compare them to the crowded groupings of quaint patterns we sometimes see in costly pieces of lacework. The most simple and remarkable of all these ornaments was that which decorated the countenance of the chief. 2 broad stripes of tattooing, diverging from the centre of his shaven crown, obliquely crossed both eyes, staining the lids to a little below each ear, where they united with another stripe which swept in a straight line along the lips and formed the base of the triangle. The warrior, from the excellence of his physical proportions, might certainly have been regarded as one of nature's noblemen, and the lines drawn upon his face may possibly have denoted his exalted rank. The warlike personage, upon entering the house, seated himself at some distance from the spot where Toby and myself reposed, while the rest of the savages looked alternately from us to him, as if in expectation of something they were disappointed in not perceiving. Regarding the chief attentively, I thought his lineaments appeared familiar to me. As soon as his full face was turned upon me, and I again beheld its extraordinary embellishment, and met the strange gaze to which I had been subjected the preceding night, I immediately, in spite of the alteration in his appearance, recognized the noble Mehevi. On addressing him, he advanced at once in the most cordial manner, and greeting me warmly, seemed to enjoy not a little the effect his barbaric costume had produced upon me. I forthwith determined to secure, if possible, the goodwill of this individual, as I easily perceived he was a man of great authority in his tribe, and one who might exert a powerful influence upon our subsequent fate. In the endeavour I was not repulsed, for nothing could surpass the friendliness he manifested towards both my companion and myself. He extended his sturdy limbs by our side and endeavoured to make us comprehend the full extent of the kindly feelings by which he was actuated. The almost insuperable difficulty in communicating to one another our ideas affected the chief with no little mortification. He evinced a great desire to be enlightened with regard to the customs and peculiarities of the far-off country we had left behind us, and to which, under the name of Manika, he frequently alluded. But that which more than any other subject engaged his attention was the late proceedings of the Frani, as he called the French, in the neighbouring bay of Nukuhava. This seemed a never-ending theme with him, and one concerning which he was never weary of interrogating us. All the information we succeeded in imparting to him on this subject was little more than that we had seen 6 men-of-war lying in the hostile bay at the time we had left it. When he received this intelligence, Mehevi, by the aid of his fingers, went through a long numerical calculation, as if estimating the number of Frenchmen the squadron might contain. It was just after employing his faculties in this way that he happened to notice the swelling in my limb. He immediately examined it with the utmost attention, and, after doing so, dispatched a boy who happened to be standing by with some message. After the lapse of a few moments, the stripling re-entered the house with an aged islander, who might have been taken for old Hippocrates himself. His head was as bald as the polished surface of a coconut shell, which article it precisely resembled in smoothness and colour, while a long silvery beard swept almost to his girdle of bark. Encircling his temples was a brandau of the twisted leaves of the omu tree, pressed closely over the brows to shield his feeble vision from the glare of the sun. His tottering steps were supported by a long, slim staff, resembling the wand with which a theatrical magician appears on the stage, and in one hand he carried a freshly plaited fan of the green leaflets of the coconut tree. A flowering robe of tapa, knotted over the shoulder, hung loosely round his stooping form, and heightened the venerableness of his aspect. Mihevi, saluting this old gentleman, motioned him to a seat between us, and then, uncovering my limb, desired him to examine it. The leech gazed intently from me to Toby, and then proceeded to business. After diligently observing the ailing member, he commenced manipulating it, and on the supposition, probably, that the complaint had deprived the leg of all sensation, began to pinch and hammer it in such a manner that I absolutely roared with pain. Thinking that I was as capable of making an application of thumps and pinches to the part as anyone else, I endeavoured to resist this species of medical treatment, but it was not so easy a matter to get out of the clutches of the old wizard. He fastened on the unfortunate limb as if it was something for which he had been long seeking, and muttering some kind of incantation, continued his discipline, pounding it after a fashion that set me well nigh crazy, while Mihevi, upon the same principle which prompts an affectionate mother to hold a struggling child in a dentist's chair, restrained me in his powerful grasp, and actually encouraged the wretch in his infliction of torture. Almost frantic with rage and pain, I yelled like a bedlamite, while Toby, throwing himself into all the attitudes of a posture master, vainly endeavoured to expostulate with the natives by signs and gestures. To have looked at my companion as sympathizing with my sufferings, he strove to put an end to them. One would have thought that he was the deaf and dumb alphabet incarnated. Whether my tormentor yielded to Toby's entreaties, or paused from sheer exhaustion, I do not know. But all at once he ceased his operations, and at the same time the chief, relinquishing his hold upon me, I fell back, faint and breathless with the agony I had endured. My unfortunate limb was now left much in the same condition as a rump steak after undergoing the castigating process which precedes cooking. My physician, having recovered from the fatigues of his exertions, as if anxious to make amends for the pain to which he had subjected me, now took some herbs out of a little wallet that was suspended from his waist, and, moisturing them in water, applied them to the inflamed part, stooping over it at the same time, and either whispering a spell or having a little confidential chat with some imaginary demon located in the calf of my leg. My limb was now swathed in leafy bandages, and grateful to Providence for the cessation of hostilities, I was suffered to rest. Mihevi, shortly after, rose to depart, but before he went, he spoke authoritatively to one of the natives whom he addressed as Kori Kori, and from the little I could understand of what took place, pointed him out to me as a man whose peculiar business thenceforth would be to attend upon my person. I am not certain that I comprehended as much as this at the time, but the subsequent conduct of my trusty body servant fully assured me that such must have been the case. I could not but be amused at the manner in which the chief addressed me upon this occasion, talking to me for at least 15 or 20 minutes as calmly as if I could understand every word that he said. I remarked this peculiarity very often afterwards in many other of the islanders. Mehevi having now departed, and the family physician having likewise made his exit, we were left about sunset with 10 or 12 natives, who by this time I had ascertained composed the household of which Toby and I were members. As the dwelling to which we had been first introduced was the place of my permanent abode while I remained in the valley, and as I was necessarily placed upon the most intimate footing with its occupants, I may as well here enter into a little description of it and its inhabitants. The description will apply also to nearly all the other dwelling places in the Vale, and will furnish some idea of the generality of the natives. Near one side of the valley, and about midway up the ascent of a rather abrupt rise of ground, waving with the richish verdure, a number of large stones were laid in successive courses, to the height of nearly 8 feet, and disposed in such a manner that their level surfaces corresponded in shape with the habitation which was perched upon it. A narrow space, however, was reserved in front of the dwelling, upon the summit of this pile of stones, called by the natives a Typee, which, being enclosed by a little picket of canes, gave it somewhat the appearance of a veranda. The frame of the house was constructed of large bamboos, planted uprightly and secured together at intervals by transverse stalks of the light wood of the herbaceous, lashed with thongs of bark. The rear of the tenement, built up with successive ranges of coconut boughs, bound one upon another, with their leaflets cunningly woven together, inclined a little from the vertical, and extended from the extreme edge of the Typee to about 20 feet from its surface, whence the shelving roof, thatched with the long tapering leaves of the palmetto, sloped steeply off to within about 5 feet of the floor, leaving the eaves drooping with tassel-like appendages over the front of the habitation. This was constructed of light and elegant canes in a kind of open screenwork, tastefully adorned with bindings of variegated sinnate, which served to hold together its various parts. The sides of the house were similarly built, thus presenting 3/4 of the circulation of the air, while the whole was impervious to the rain. In length, this picturesque building was perhaps 12 yards, while in breadth it could not have exceeded as many feet. So much for the exterior, which, with its wire-like retwisted sides, not a little reminded me of an immense aviary. Stooping a little, you pass through a narrow aperture in its front, and facing you, on entering, lay 2 long, perfectly straight and well-polished trunks of the coconut tree, extending the full length of the dwelling, one of them placed closely against the rear, and the other lying parallel with it some 2 yards distant, the interval between them being spread with a multitude of gaily worked mats, nearly all of a different pattern. This space formed the common couch and lounging place of the natives, answering the purpose of a divan in Oriental countries. Here would they slumber through the hours of the night and recline luxuriously during the greater part of the day. The remainder of the floor presented only the cool, shining surfaces of the large stones of which the Typee was composed. From the ridgepole of the house hung suspended a number of large packages enveloped in coarse tappa, some of which contained festival dresses and various other matters of the wardrobe, held in high estimation. These were easily accessible by means of a line which, passing over the ridgepole, had one end attached to a bundle, while the other, which led to the side of the dwelling, and was there secured, the package could be lowered or elevated at pleasure. Against the farther wall of the house were arranged in tasteful figures a variety of spears and javelins, and other implements of savage warfare. Outside of the habitation, and built upon the piazza-like area in its front, was a little shed used as a sort of larder or pantry, and in which were stored various articles of domestic use and convenience. A few yards from the Typee was a large shed built of coconut boughs, where the process of preparing the poe was carried on, and all culinary operations attended to. Thus much for the house and its appurtenances, and it will be readily acknowledged that a more commodious and appropriate dwelling for the climate and the people could not possibly be devised. It was cool, free to admit the air, scrupulously clean, and elevated above the dampness and impurities of the ground. But now to sketch the inmates, and here I claim for my tried servitor and faithful valet, Kori, the precedence of a first description. As his character will be gradually unfolded in the course of my narrative, I shall for the present content myself with delineating his personal appearance. Kori, though the most devoted and best-natured serving man in the world, was, alas, a hideous object to look upon. He was some 25 years of age and about 6 feet in height, robust and well-made, and of the most extraordinary aspect. His head was carefully shaven with the exception of 2 circular spots, about the size of a dollar, near the top of the cranium, where the hair, permitted to grow of an amazing length, was twisted up into 2 prominent knots. That gave him the appearance of being decorated with a pair of horns. His beard, plucked out by the root from every other part of his face, was suffered to droop in hairy pendants, 2 of which garnished his upper lip, and an equal number hung from the extremity of his chin. Kori, with a view of improving the handiwork of nature, and perhaps prompted by a desire to add to the engaging expression of his countenance, had seen fit to embellish his face with 3 broad, longitudinal stripes of tattooing, which, like those country roads that go straight forward in defiance of all obstacles, crossed his nasal organ, descended into the hollow of his eyes, and even skirted the borders of his mouth. Each completely spanned his physiognomy, one extending in a line with his eyes, another crossing the face in the vicinity of the nose, and the third sweeping along his lips from ear to ear. His countenance, thus triply hooped, as it were, with tattooing, always reminded me of those unhappy wretches whom I have sometimes observed gazing out sentimentally from behind the grated bars of a prison window, whilst the entire body of my savage valet covered all over with representations of birds and fishes, and a variety of most unaccountable-looking creatures, suggested to me the idea of a pictorial museum of natural history or an illustrated copy of Goldsmith's Animated Nature. But it seems really heartless in me to write thus of the poor islander, when I owe perhaps to his unremitting attentions the very existence I now enjoy. Corrie, Corrie, I mean thee no harm in what I say in regard to thy outward adornings, but they were a little curious to my unaccustomed sight, and therefore I dilate upon them. But to underrate or forget thy faithful services is something I could never be guilty of, even in the giddiest moment of my life. The father of my attached follower was a native of gigantic frame, and had once possessed prodigious physical powers, but the lofty form was now yielding to the inroads of time, though the hand of disease seemed never to have been laid upon the aged warrior. Maheo, for such was his name, appeared to have retired from all active participation in the affairs of the valley, seldom or never accompanying the natives in their various expeditions, and employing the greater part of his time in throwing up a little shed just outside the house, upon which he was engaged, to my certain knowledge, for 4 months, without appearing to make any sensible advance. I suppose the old gentleman was in his dotage, for he manifested in various ways the characteristics which mark this particular stage of life. I remember in particular his having a choice pair of ear ornaments, fabricated from the teeth of some sea monster. These he would alternately wear and take off at least 50 times in the course of the day, going and coming from his little hut on each occasion with all the tranquillity imaginable. Sometimes, slipping them through the slits in his eyes, he would seize his spear, which in length and slightness resembled a fishing pole, and go stalking beneath the shadows of the neighbouring groves, as if about to give a hostile meeting to some cannibal knight. But he would soon return again, and hiding his weapon under the projecting eaves of the house, and rolling his clumsy trinkets carefully in a piece of tappa, would resume his more pacific operations as quietly as if he had never interrupted them. But despite his eccentricities, Maheo was a most paternal and warm-hearted old fellow, and in this particular not a little resembled his son Corrie Corrie. The mother of the latter was the mistress of the family, and a notable housewife, and a most industrious old lady she was. If she did not understand the art of making jellies, jams, custard, tea cakes, and such like trashy affairs, she was profoundly skilled in the mysteries of preparing ama, poe, and koku, with other substantial matters. She was a genuine busybody, bustling about the house like a country landlady at an unexpected arrival, forever giving the young girls tasks to perform, which the little hussies as often neglected, poking into every corner and rummaging over bundles of old tappa, or making a prodigious clatter among the calabashes. Sometimes she might have been seen squatting upon her haunches in front of a huge wooden basin, and, kneading poe with terrific vehemence, dashing the stone pestle about as if she would shiver the vessel into fragments, on other occasions galloping about the valley in search of a particular kind of leaf used in some of her recondite operations, and returning home toiling and sweating with a bundle of it under which most women would have sunk. To tell the truth, Corrie Corrie's mother was the only industrious person in all the valley of Typee, and she could not have employed herself more actively had she been left an exceedingly muscular and destitute widow with an inordinate supply of young children in the bleakest part of the civilized world. There was not the slightest necessity for the greater portion of the labour performed by the old lady, but she seemed to work from some irresistible impulse, her limbs continually swaying to and fro, as if there were some indefatigable engine concealed within her body which kept her in perpetual motion. Never suppose that she was a termagant or a shrew for all this. She had the kindliest heart in the world, and acted towards me, in particular, in a truly maternal manner, occasionally putting some little morsel of choice food into my hand, some outlandish kind of savage sweetmeat or pastry, like a doting mother petting a sickly urchin with tarts and sugar plums. Warm indeed are my remembrances of the dear, good, affectionate old tinner. Besides the individuals I have mentioned, there belonged to the household 3 young men, dissipated, good-for-nothing, roistering blades of savages, who were either employed in prosecuting love affairs with the maidens of the tribe, or grew boozy on ava and tobacco in the company of congenial spirits, the scapegraces of the valley. Among the permanent inmates of the house were likewise several lovely damsels, who, instead of thrumping pianos and reading novels, like more enlightened young ladies, substituted for those employments the manufacture of a fine species of tapper, but for the greater portion of the time were skipping from house to house, gadding and gossiping with their acquaintances. From the rest of these, however, I must expect the beauteous nymph Fayaway, who was my peculiar favourite. Her free, pliant figure was the very perfection of female grace and beauty. Her complexion was a rich and mantling olive, and when watching the glow upon her cheeks, I could almost swear that beneath the transparent medium there lurked the blushes of a faint vermilion. The face of this girl was a rounded oval, and each feature as perfectly formed as the heart or imagination of man could desire. Her full lips, when parted with a smile, disclosed teeth of a dazzling whiteness, and when her rosy mouth opened with a burst of merriment, they looked like the milk-white seeds of the arter, a fruit of the valley, which, when cleft in twain, shows them reposing in rows on each side, embedded in the red and juicy pulp. Her hair of the deepest brown, parted irregularly in the middle, flowed in natural ringlets over her shoulders, and whenever she chanced to stoop, fell over and hid from view her lovely bosom. Gazing into the depths of her strange blue eyes, when she was in a contemplative mood, they seemed most placid, yet unfathomable. But when illuminated by some lively emotion, they beamed upon the beholder like stars. The hands of Fayaway were as soft and delicate as those as any countess, for an entire exemption from rude labour makes the girlhood and even prime of a Typee woman's life. Her feet, though wholly exposed, were as diminutive and fairly shaped as those which peep from beneath the skirts of a Lima lady's dress. The skin of this young creature, from continual ablutions and the use of mollifying ointments, was inconceivably smooth and soft. I may succeed, perhaps, in particularizing some of the individual features of Fayaway's beauty, but that general loveliness of appearance which they all contributed to produce, I will not attempt to describe. The easy, unstudied graces of a child of nature like this, breathing from infancy an atmosphere of perpetual summer, and nurtured by the simple fruits of the earth, enjoying a perfect freedom from care and anxiety, and removed effectually from all injurious tendencies, strike the eye in a manner which cannot be portrayed. This picture is no fancy sketch. It is drawn from the most vivid recollections of the person delineated. Were I asked if the beauteous form of Fayaway was altogether free from the hideous blemish of tattooing, I should be constrained to answer that it was not. But the practitioners of the barbarous art, so remorseless in their inflictions upon the brawny limbs of the warriors of the tribe, seem to be conscious that it needs not the resources of their profession to augment the charms of the maidens of the vale. The females are very little embellished in this way, and Fayaway and all the other young girls of her age were even less so than those of their sex more advanced in years. The reason of this peculiarity will be alluded to hereafter. All the tattooing that the nymph in question exhibited upon her person may be easily described. 3 minute dots, no bigger than pinheads, decorated each lip, and at a little distance were not at all discernible. Just upon the fall of the shoulder were drawn 2 parallel lines, half an inch apart, and perhaps 3 inches in length, the interval being filled with delicately executed figures. These narrow bands of tattooing, thus placed, always reminded me of those stripes and gold lace worn by officers in undress, and which are in lieu of epaulets to denote their rank. Thus much was Fayaway tattooed. The audacious hand, which had gone so far in its desecrating work, stopping short, apparently wanting the heart to proceed. But I have omitted to describe the dress worn by this nymph of the valley. Fayaway, I must avow the fact, for the most part clung to the primitive and summer garb of Eden. But how becoming the costume! It showed her fine figure to the best possible advantage, and nothing could have been better adapted to her peculiar style of beauty. On ordinary occasions she was habited precisely as I have described the 2 youthful savages whom we had met on first entering the valley. At other times, when rambling among the groves, or visiting at the houses of her acquaintances, she wore a tunic of white tapa, reaching from her waist to a little below the knees, and when exposed for any length of time to the sun, she invariably protected herself from its rays by a floating mantle of the same material, loosely gathered about the person. Her gala dress will be described hereafter. As the beauties of our own land delight in bedecking themselves with fanciful articles of jewellery, suspending them from their ears, hanging them about their necks, and clasping them around their wrists, so Fayaway and her companions were in the habit of ornamenting themselves with similar appendages. Flora was their jeweller. Sometimes they wore necklaces of small carnation flowers, strung like rubies upon a fibre of tapa, or displayed in their ears a single white bud, the stem thrust backward through the aperture and showing in the front the delicate petals folded together in a beautiful sphere and looking like a drop of the purest pearl. Chaplets, too, resembling in their arrangement the strawberry coronal worn by an English peeress. and composed of intertwined leaves and blossoms, often crowned their temples, and bracelets and anklets of the same tasteful pattern were frequently to be seen. Indeed, the maidens of the island were passionately fond of flowers, and never wearied of decorating their persons with them, a lovely trait in their character, and one that ere long will be more fully alluded to. Though in my eyes, at least, Fayaway was indisputably the loveliest female I saw in Typee, yet the description I have given of her will in some measure apply to nearly all the youthful portion of her sex in the valley. Judge thee then, reader, what beautiful creatures they must have been. Chapter 12. Officiousness of Kori Kori, his devotion, a bath in the stream, want of refinement of the Typee damsels, stroll with Mehevi, a Typee highway, the Taboo groves, the hula hula ground, the time-worn savages, hospitality of Mehevi, midnight musings, adventures in the dark, distinguished honours paid to the visitors, strange procession and return to the house of Maheyo. When Mehevi had departed from the house, as related in the preceding chapter, Kori Kori commenced the functions of the post assigned him. He brought out various kinds of food, and, as if I were an infant, insisted upon feeding me with his own hands. To this procedure I, of course, most earnestly objected, but in vain, and, having laid a calabash of cuckoo before me, he washed his fingers in a vessel of water, and then, putting his hands into the dish and rolling the food into little balls, put them one after another into my mouth. All my remonstrances against this measure only provoked so great a clamour on his part that I was obliged to acquiesce, and the operation of feeding being thus facilitated, the meal was quickly dispatched. As for Toby, he was allowed to help himself after his own fashion. The repast over, my attendant arranged the mats for repose, and, bidding me lie down, covered me with a large robe of tapa, at the same time looking approvingly upon me and exclaiming, "Kai, kai, nui, nui, moi, moi, motaki, eat plenty, sleep very good." The philosophy of this sentiment I did not pretend to question, for deprived of sleep for several preceding nights, and the pain of my limb having much abated, I now felt inclined to avail myself of the opportunity afforded me. The next morning, on waking, I found Kori Kori stretched out on one side of me, while my companion lay upon the other. I felt sensibly refreshed after a night of sound repose, and immediately agreed to the proposition of my valet that I should repair to the water and wash, although dreading the suffering that the exertion might produce. From this apprehension, however, I was quickly relieved, for Kori Kori, leaping from the Typee and then backing himself up against it, like a porter in readiness to shoulder a trunk, with loud vociferations and a superabundance of gestures, gave me to understand that I was to mount upon his back and thus transported to the stream, which flowed perhaps 200 yards from the house. Our appearance upon the veranda in front of the habitation drew together quite a crowd, who stood looking on and conversing with one another in the most animated manner. They reminded one of a group of idlers gathered about the door of a village tavern, when the equipage of some distinguished traveller is brought round previously to his departure. As soon as I clasped my arms about the neck of the devoted fellow, and he jogged off with me, the crowd, composed chiefly of young girls and boys, followed after, shouting and capering with infinite glee, and accompanied us to the banks of the stream. On gaining it, Korikori waded up to his hips in the water, carried me halfway across, and deposited me on a smooth black stone which rose a few inches above the surface. The amphibious rabble at our heels plunged in after us, and climbing to the summit of the grass-grown rocks with which the bed of the brook was here and there broken, waited curiously to witness our morning ablutions. Somewhat embarrassed by the presence of the female portion of the company, and feeling my cheeks burning with bashful timidity, I formed a primitive basin by joining my hands together and cooled my blushes in the water it contained. Then, removing my frock, bent over and washed myself down to my waist in the stream. As soon as Korikori comprehended from my motions that this was to be the extent of my performance, he appeared perfectly aghast with astonishment, and rushing towards me, poured out a torrent of words in eager depreciation of so limited an operation, enjoining me by unmistakable signs to immerse my whole body. To this I was forced to consent, and the honest fellow, regarding me as a froward, inexperienced child, whom it was his duty to serve at the risk of offending, lifted me from the rocks and tenderly bathed my limbs. This over, and resuming my seat, I could not avoid bursting into admiration of the scene around me. From the verdant surfaces of the large stones that lay scattered about, the natives were now sliding off into the water, diving and ducking beneath the surface in all directions, the young girls springing buoyantly into the air and revealing their naked forms to the waist, with their long tresses dancing about their shoulders, their eyes sparkling like drops of dew in the sun, and their gay laughter pealing forth at every frolicsome incident. On the afternoon of the day that I took my first bath in the valley, we received another visit from Mehevi. The noble savage seemed to be in the same pleasant mood, and was quite as cordial in his manner as before. After remaining about an hour, he rose from the mats and, motioning to leave the house, invited Toby and myself to accompany him. I pointed to my leg, but Mehevi in his turn pointed to Korikori, and removed that objection. So, mounting upon the faithful fellow's shoulders again, like the old man of the sea astride of Sinbad, I followed after the chief. The nature of the route we now pursued struck me more forcibly than anything I had yet seen, as illustrating the indolent disposition of the islanders. The path was obviously the most beaten one in the valley, several others leading from each side into it, and perhaps for successive generations it had formed the principal avenue of the place. And yet, until I grew more familiar with its impediments, it seemed as difficult to travel as the recesses of a wilderness. Part of it swept around an abrupt rise of ground, the surface of which was broken by frequent inequalities and thickly strewn with projecting masses of rocks, whose summits were often hidden from view by the drooping foliage of the luxurious vegetation. Sometimes directly over, sometimes evading these obstacles with a wide circuit, the path wound along, one moment climbing over a sudden eminence smooth with continued wear, then descending on the other side into a steep glen and crossing the flinty channel of a brook. Here it pursued the depths of a glade, occasionally obliging you to stoop beneath vast horizontal branches, and now you stepped over huge trunks and boughs that lay rotting across the track. Such was the grand thoroughfare of Typee. After proceeding a little distance along it, Korikori, panting and blowing with the weight of his burden, I dismounted from his back, and grasping the long spear of Mihevi in my hand, assisted my steps over the numerous obstacles of the road, preferring this mode of advance to one which, from the difficulties of the way, was equally painful to myself and my wearied servitor. Our journey was soon at an end, for, scaling a sudden height, we came abruptly upon the place of our destination. I wish that it were possible to sketch in words this spot as vividly as I recollect it. Here were situated the taboo groves of the valley, the scene of many a prolonged feast, of many a horrid rite. Beneath the dark shadows of the consecrated breadfruit trees there reigned a solemn twilight, a cathedral-like gloom. The frightful genius of pagan worship seemed to brood in silence over the place, breathing its spell upon every object around. Here and there, in the depths of these awful shades, half screened from sight by the masses of overhanging foliage, rose the idolatrous altars of the savages, built of enormous blocks of black and polished stone, placed one upon another without cement to the height of 12 or 15 feet, and surmounted by a rustic open temple, enclosed with a low picket of canes, within which might be seen, in various stages of decay, offerings of breadfruit and coconuts, and the putrefying relics of some recent sacrifice. In the midst of the wood was the hallowed hula-hula ground, set apart for the celebration of the fantastical religious ritual of these people, comprising an extensive oblong pai-pai, terminating at either end in a lofty terraced altar, guarded by ranks of hideous wooden idols, and with the two remaining sides flanked by ranges of bamboo sheds, opening towards the interior of the quadrangle thus formed. Vast trees, standing in the middle of this space, and throwing it an umbrageous shade, had their massive trunks built round with slight stages, elevated a few feet above the ground and railed in with canes, forming so many rustic pulpits from which the priests harangued their devotees. This holiest of spots was defended from profanation by the strictest edicts of the all-pervading Taboo, which condemned to instant death the sacrilegious female who should enter or touch its sacred precincts, or even so much as press with her feet the ground made holy by the shadows that it cast. Access was had to the enclosure through an embowered entrance on one side, facing a number of towering coconut trees, planted at intervals along a level area of 100 yards. At the further extremity of this space was to be seen a building of considerable size, reserved for the habitation of the priests and religious attendants of the groves. In its vicinity was another remarkable edifice, built as usual upon the summit of Pai-Pai, and at least 200 feet in length, though not more than 20 in breadth. The whole front of this latter structure was completely open, and from one end to the other ran a narrow veranda, fenced in on the edge of the Pai-Pai with a picket of canes. Its interior presented the appearance of an immense lounging place, the entire floor being strewn with successive layers of mats, lying between parallel trunks of coconut trees, selected for the purpose from the straightest and most symmetrical the vale afforded. To this building Denominated in the language of the natives, the Tai Mi Heavy now conducted us. Thus far we had been accompanied by a troop of the natives, of both sexes, but as soon as we approached its vicinity, the females gradually separated themselves from the crowd, and standing aloof, permitted us to pass on. The merciless prohibitions of the taboo extended likewise to this edifice, and were enforced by the same dreadful penalty that secured the hula-hula ground from the imaginary pollution of a woman's presence. On entering the house, I was surprised to see 6 muskets ranged against the bamboo on one side, from the barrels of which depended as many small canvas pouches, partly filled with powder. Disposed about these muskets, like the cutlasses that decorate the bulkhead of a man-of-war's cabin, were a great variety of rude spears and paddles, javelins and war-clubs. This, then, said I to Toby, must be the armoury of the tribe. As we advanced further along the building, we were struck with the aspect of 4 or 5 hideous old wretches, on whose decrepit forms time and tattooing seemed to have obliterated every trace of humanity. Owing to the continued operation of the latter process, which only terminates among the warriors of the island after all the figures stretched upon their limbs in youth have been blended together, an effect, however, produced only in cases of extreme longevity, the bodies of these men were of a uniform dull green colour, the hue which the tattooing gradually assumes as the individual advances in age. Their skin had a frightful scaly appearance, which, united with its singular colour, made their limbs not a little resemble dusty specimens of verdure antique. Their flesh, in parts, hung upon them in huge folds, like the overlapping plaits on the flank of a rhinoceros. Their heads were completely bald, whilst their faces were puckered into 1,000 wrinkles, and they presented no vestige of a beard. But the most remarkable peculiarity about them was the appearance of their feet. The toes, like the radiating lines of the mariner's compass, pointed to every quarter of the horizon. This was doubtless attributable to the fact that during nearly 100 years of existence the said toes never had been subjected to any artificial confinement, and in their old age, being averse to close neighbourhood, bid one another keep open order. These repulsive-looking creatures appeared to have lost the use of their lower limbs altogether, sitting upon the floor cross-legged in a state of torpor. They never heeded us in the least, scarcely looking conscious of our presence, while Mihevi seated us upon the mats, and Kori gave utterance to some unintelligible gibberish. In a few moments a boy entered with a wooden trencher of poi, and in regaling myself with its contents, I was obliged again to submit to the officious intervention of my indefatigable servitor. Various other dishes followed, the chief manifesting the most hospitable importunity in pressing us to partake, and to remove all bashfulness on our part, set us no despicable example in his own person. The repast concluded, a pipe was lighted, which passed from mouth to mouth, and yielding to its soporific influence the quiet of the place and the deepening shadows of approaching night, my companion and I sank into a kind of drowsy repose, while the chief and Kori seemed to be slumbering beside us. I awoke from an uneasy nap about midnight, as I supposed, and, raising myself partly from the mat, became sensible that we were enveloped in utter darkness. Toby lay still asleep, but our late companions had disappeared. The only sound that interrupted the silence of the place was the asthmatic breathing of the old men I have mentioned, who reposed at a little distance from us. Besides them, as well as I could judge, there was no one else in the house. Apprehensive of some evil, I roused my comrade, and we were engaged in a whispered conference concerning the unexpected withdrawal of the natives, when all at once, from the depths of the grove, in full view of us where we lay, shoots of flame were seen to rise, and in a few moments illuminated the surrounding trees, casting, by contrast, into still deeper gloom the darkness around us. While we continued gazing at this sight, dark figures appeared moving to and fro before the flames, while others, dancing and capering about, looked like so many demons. Regarding this new phenomenon with no small degree of trepidation, I said to my companion, "What can all this mean, Toby?" "Oh, nothing," replied he. "Getting the fire ready, I suppose." "Fire!" exclaimed I, while my heart took to beating like a trip-hammer. "What fire?" "Why, the fire to cook us, to be sure. What else would the cannibals be kicking up such a row about if it were not for that?" "Oh, Toby, have done with your jokes. This is no time for them. Something is about to happen, I feel confident." "Jokes, indeed!" exclaimed Toby indignantly. "Did you ever hear me joke? Why, for what do you suppose the devils have been feeding us up in this kind of style during the last 3 days? Unless it were for something that you are too much frightened at to talk about. Look at that Corry there. Has he not been stuffing you with his confounded mushes, just in the way they treat swine before they kill them? Depend upon it, we will be eaten this blessed night, and there is the fire we shall be roasted by." This view of the matter was not at all calculated to allay my apprehensions, and I shuddered when I reflected that we were indeed at the mercy of a tribe of cannibals, and that the dreadful contingency to which Toby had alluded was by no means removed beyond the bounds of possibility. "There, I told you so. They are coming for us," exclaimed my companion the next moment, as the forms of 4 of the islanders were seen in bold relief against the illuminated background mounting the Typee and approaching towards us. They came on noiselessly, nay, stealthily, and glided along through the gloom that surrounded us, as if about to spring upon some object they were fearful of disturbing before they should make sure of it. Gracious heaven! The horrible reflections which crowded upon me that moment. A cold sweat stood upon my brow, and spellbound with terror I awaited my fate. Suddenly the silence was broken by the well-remembered tones of me heavy, and at the kindly accents of his voice my fears were immediately dissipated. "Tomo, Toby, Kai, eat." He had waited to address us, until he had assured himself that we were both awake, at which he seemed somewhat surprised. "Kai, is it?" said Toby, in his gruff tones. "Well, cook us first, will you? But what's this?" he added, as another savage appeared, bearing before him a large trencher of wood containing some kind of steaming meat, as appeared from the odours it diffused, and which he deposited at the feet of me heavy. "A baked baby, I dare say I, but I will have none of it, never mind what it is. A pretty fool I should make of myself indeed, waked up here in the middle of the night, stuffing and guzzling, and all to make a fat meal for a parcel of booby-minded cannibals one of these mornings. No, I see what they are at very plainly, so I am resolved to starve myself into a bunch of bones and gristle. and then, if they serve me up, they are welcome. But I say, Tomo, you are not going to eat any of that mess there, in the dark, are you? Why, how can you tell what it is? By tasting it, to be sure, said I, masticating a morsel that Kori had just put in my mouth. And excellently good it is too, very much like veal. A baked baby, by the soul of Captain Cook, burst forth Toby with amazing vehemence. Veal? Why, there never was a calf on the island till you landed. I tell you, you are bolting down mouthfuls of a dead happer's carcass as sure as you live, and no mistake. Emetics and lukewarm water. What a sensation in the abdominal region! Sure enough, where could the fiends incarnate have obtained meat? But I resolved to satisfy myself at all hazards, and turning to me heavy, I soon made the ready chief understand that I wished a light to be brought. When the taper came, I gazed eagerly into the vessel, and recognized the mutilated remains of a juvenile porker. "Puaki!" exclaimed Kori, looking complacently at the dish, and from that day to this I have never forgotten that such is the designation of a pig in the Typee lingo. The next morning, after being again abundantly feasted by the hospitality, me heavy, Toby, and myself arose to depart. But the chief requested us to postpone our intention. Abo, wait, he said, and accordingly we resumed our seats, while, assisted by the zealous Kori, he appeared to be engaged in giving directions to a number of the natives outside, who were busily employed in making arrangements, the nature of which we could not comprehend. But we were not left long in our ignorance, for a few moments only had elapsed when the chief beckoned us to approach, and we perceived that he had been marshalling a kind of guard of honour to escort us on our return to the house of Maaheho. The procession was led off by two venerable-looking savages, each provided with a spear, from the end of which streamed a pennon of milk-white tapper. After them went several youths, bearing aloft calabashes of poe, and followed in their turn by 4 stalwart fellows, sustaining long bamboos, from the tops of which hung suspended, at least 20 feet from the ground, large baskets of green bread fruits. Then came a troop of boys, carrying bunches of ripe bananas, and baskets made of the woven leaflets of coconut boughs, filled with the young fruit of the tree, the naked shells stripped of their husks, peeping forth from the verdant wicker work that surrounded them. Last of all came a burly islander, holding over his head a wooden trencher, in which lay disposed the remnants of our midnight feast, hidden from view, however, by a covering of breadfruit leaves. Astonished as I was at this exhibition, I could not avoid smiling at its grotesque appearance, and the associations it naturally called up. Mehevi, it seemed, was bent on replenishing old Maaheo's larder, fearful perhaps that without this precaution his guests might not fare as well as they could desire. As soon as I descended from the Typee, the procession formed anew, enclosing us in its centre, where I remained part of the time, carried by Kori, and occasionally relieving him from his burden by limping along with spear. When we moved off in this order, the natives struck up a musical recitative, which, with various alternations, they continued until we arrived at the place of our destination. As we proceeded on our way, bands of young girls, darting from the surrounding groves, hung upon our skirts and accompanied us with shouts of merriment and delight, which almost drowned the deep notes of the recitative. On approaching old Marheyo's domicile, its inmates rushed out to receive us, and while the gifts of Mihevi were being disposed of, the superanimated warrior did the honours of his mansion with all the warmth of hospitality evinced by an English squire when he regales his friends at some fine old patrimonial mansion. Chapter 13. Attempt to procure relief from Nuki Haver. Perilous adventure of Toby in the Hapar Mountains. Eloquence of Kori Kori. Amidst these novel scenes, a week passed away almost imperceptibly. The natives, actuated by some mysterious impulse, day after day redoubled their attentions to us. Their manner towards us was unaccountable. Surely, thought I, they would not act thus if they meant us any harm. But why this excess of deferential kindness? Or what equivalent can they imagine us capable of rendering them for it? We were fairly puzzled, but despite the apprehensions, I could not dispel the horrible character imputed to these Typees appeared to be wholly undeserved. "Why, they are cannibals," said Toby, on one occasion when I eulogized the tribe. "Granted," I replied, "but a more humane, gentlemanly, and amiable set of epicures do not probably exist in the Pacific." But notwithstanding the kind treatment we received, I was too familiar with the fickle disposition of savages not to feel anxious to withdraw from the valley and put myself beyond the reach of that fearful death which, under all these smiling appearances, might yet menace us. But here there was an obstacle in the way of doing so. It was idle for me to think of moving from the place until I should have recovered from the severe lameness that afflicted me. Indeed, my malady began seriously to alarm me, for, despite the herbal remedies of the natives, it continued to grow worse and worse. Their mild applications, though they soothed the pain, did not remove the disorder, and I felt convinced that without better aid I might anticipate long and acute suffering. But how was this aid to be procured? From the surgeons of the French fleet, which probably still lay in the bay of Nuki Haver? It might easily have been obtained. Could I have made my case known to them? But how could that be effected? At last, in the exigency to which I was reduced, I proposed to Toby that he should endeavour to go round to Nuki Haver, and, if he could not succeed in returning to the valley by water, in one of the boats of the squadron, and taking me off, he might at least procure me some proper medicines, and effect his return overland. My companion listened to me in silence, and at first did not appear to relish the idea. The truth was, he felt impatient to escape from the place, and wished to avail himself of our present high favour with the natives to make good our retreat, before we should experience some sudden alteration in their behaviour. As he could not think of leaving me in my helpless condition, he implored me to be of good cheer, assured me that I should soon be better, and enabled in a few days to return with him to Nuki Haver. Added to this, he could not bear the idea of again returning to this dangerous place, and as for the expedition of persuading the Frenchmen to detach a boat's crew for the purpose of rescuing me from the Typees, he looked upon it as idle, and with arguments that I could not answer, urged the improbability of their provoking the hostilities of the clan by any such measure, especially as for the purpose of quieting its apprehensions, they had as yet refrained from making any visit to the bay. "And even should they consent," said Toby, "they would only produce a commotion in the valley, in which we might both be sacrificed by these ferocious islanders." This was unanswerable, but still I clung to the belief that he might succeed in accomplishing the other part of my plan, and at last I overcame his scruples, and he agreed to make the attempt. As soon as we succeeded in making the natives understand our intention, they broke out into the most vehement opposition to the measure, and for a while I almost despaired of obtaining their consent. At the bare thought of one of us leaving them, they manifested the most lively concern. The grief and consternation of Korikori, in particular, was unbounded. He threw himself into a perfect paroxysm of gestures, which were intended to convey to us not only his abhorrence of Nuku'hiva and its uncivilized inhabitants, but also his astonishment that after becoming acquainted with the enlightened Typees, we should evince the least desire to withdraw, even for a time, from their agreeable society. However, I overbore his objections by appealing to my lameness, from which I assured the natives I should speedily recover if Toby were permitted to obtain the supplies I needed. It was agreed that on the following morning my companion should depart, accompanied by some one or two of the household, who should point out to him an easy route by which the bay might be reached before sunset. At early dawn of the next day, our habitation was astir. One of the young men mounted into an adjoining coconut tree and threw down a number of the young fruit, which old Maheo quickly stripped of the green husks and strung together upon a short pole. These were intended to refresh Toby on his route. The preparations being completed, with no little emotion, I bade my companion adieu. He promised to return in 3 days at farthest, and, bidding me keep up my spirits in the interval, turned round the corner of the Typee and, under the guidance of the venerable Maheo, was soon out of sight. His departure oppressed me with melancholy, and, re-entering the dwelling, I threw myself almost in despair upon the matting of the floor. In 2 hours' time the old warrior returned, and gave me to understand that after accompanying my companion a little distance and showing him the route, he had left him journeying on his way. It was about noon of this same day, a season which these people are wont to pass in sleep, that I lay in the house, surrounded by its slumbering inmates and painfully affected by the strange silence which prevailed. All at once I thought I heard a faint shout, as if proceeding from some persons in the depth of the grove which extended in front of our habitation. The sounds grew louder and nearer, and gradually the whole valley rang with wild outcries. The sleepers around me started to their feet in alarm, and hurried outside to discover the cause of the commotion. Korikori, who had been the first to spring up, soon returned almost breathless, and nearly frantic with the excitement under which he seemed to be labouring. All that I could understand from him was that some accident had happened to Toby. Apprehensive of some dreadful calamity, I rushed out of the house and caught sight of the tumultuous crowd, who, with shrieks and lamentations, were just emerging from the grove, bearing in their arms some object, the sight of which produced all this transport of sorrow. As they drew near, the men redoubled their cries, while the girls, tossing their bare arms in the air, exclaimed plaintively, "Awa! Awa! Toby, Muki, Moi! Alas, alas, Toby is killed." In a moment the crowd opened and disclosed the apparently lifeless body of my companion, home between 2 men, the head hanging heavily against the breast of the foremost, the whole face, neck, Back and bosom were covered with blood, which still trickled slowly from a wound behind the temple. In the midst of the greatest uproar and confusion, the body was carried into the house and laid on a mat. Waving the natives off to give room and air, I bent eagerly over Toby and, laying my hand upon the breast, ascertained that the heart still beat. Overjoyed at this, I seized a calabash of water and dashed its contents upon his face, then, wiping away the blood, anxiously examined the wound. It was about 3 inches long, and on removing the clotted hair from about it, showed the skull laid completely bare. Immediately, with my knife, I cut away at the heavy locks, and bathed the part repeatedly in water. In a few moments, Toby revived, and opening his eyes for a second, closed them again without speaking. Corry, who had been kneeling beside me, now chafed his limbs gently with the palms of his hands, while a young girl at his head kept fanning him, and I still continued to moisten his lips and brow. Soon my poor comrade showed signs of animation, and I succeeded in making him swallow from a coconut shell a few mouthfuls of water. Old Tina now appeared, holding in her hand some samples she had gathered, the juice of which she by signs besought me to squeeze into the wound. Having done so, I thought it best to leave Toby undisturbed, until he should have time to rally his faculties. Several times he opened his lips, but fearful for his safety, I enjoined silence. In the course of 2 or 3 hours, however, he sat up, and was sufficiently recovered to tell me what had occurred. After leaving the house with Maheo, said Toby, we struck across the valley and ascended the opposite heights. Just beyond them, my guide informed me, lay the valley of Hapa, while along their summits and skirting the head of the vale was my route to Nuki Hava. After mounting a little way up the elevation, my guide paused, and gave me to understand that he could not accompany me any farther, and by various signs intimated that he was afraid to approach any nearer the territories of the enemies of his tribe. He, however, pointed out my path, which now lay clearly before me, and bidding me farewell, hastily descended the mountain. Quite elated at being so near the Hapas, I pushed up the acclivity and soon gained its summit. It tapered to a sharp ridge, from whence I beheld both the hostile valleys. Here I sat down and rested for a moment, refreshing myself with my coconuts. I was soon again pursuing my way along the height, when suddenly I saw 3 of the islanders, who must have just come out of Hapa Valley, standing in the path ahead of me. They were each armed with a heavy spear, and one, from his appearance, I took to be a chief. They sung out something, I could not understand what, and beckoned me to come on. Without the least hesitation I advanced towards them, and had approached within about a yard of the foremost, when, pointing angrily to the Typee valley, and uttering some savage exclamation, he wheeled round his weapon like lightning and struck me in a moment to the ground. The blow inflicted this wound, and took away my senses. As soon as I came to myself, I perceived the 3 islanders standing a little distance off, and apparently engaged in some violent altercation respecting me. My first impulse was to run for it, but in endeavouring to rise, I fell back and rolled down a little grassy precipice. The shock seemed to rally my faculties, so, starting to my feet, I fled down the path I had just descended. I had no need to look behind me, for, from the yells I heard, I knew that my enemies were in full pursuit. Urged on by their fearful outcries, and heedless of the injury I had received, though the blood flowing from the wound trickled over into my eyes and almost blinded me, I rushed down the mountainside with the speed of the wind. In a short time, I had descended nearly a third of the distance, and the savages had ceased their cries, when suddenly a terrific howl burst upon my ear, and at the same moment a heavy javelin darted past me as I fled, and stuck quivering in a tree close to me. Another yell followed, and a second spear and a third shot through the air within a few feet of my body, both of them piercing the ground obliquely in advance of me. The fellows gave a roar of rage and disappointment, but they were afraid, I suppose, of coming down further into the Typee valley, and so abandoned the chase. I saw them recover their weapons and turn back, and I continued my descent as fast as I could. What could have caused this ferocious attack on the part of these happers, I could not imagine, unless it were that they had seen me ascending the mountain with Maheo, and that the mere fact of coming from the Typee valley was sufficient to provoke them. As long as I was in danger, I scarcely felt the wound I had received, but when the chase was over, I began to suffer from it. I had lost my hat in the flight, and the sun scorched my bare head. I felt faint and giddy, but fearful of falling to the ground beyond the reach of assistance, I staggered on as well as I could, and at last gained the level of the valley, and then down I sank, and I knew nothing more until I found myself lying upon these mats, and you stooping over me with the calabash of water. Such was Toby's account of this sad affair. I afterwards learned that, fortunately, he had fallen close to a spot where the natives go for fuel. A party of them caught sight of him as he fell, and sounding the alarm, had lifted him up, and after ineffectually endeavouring to restore him at the brook, had hurried forward with him to the house. This incident threw a dark cloud over our prospects. It reminded us that we were hemmed in by hostile tribes, whose territories we could not hope to pass on our route to Nukuheva without encountering the effects of their savage resentment. There appeared to be no avenue opened to our escape but the sea, which washed the lower extremities of the vale. Our Typee friends availed themselves of the recent disaster of Toby to exhort us to a due appreciation of the blessings we enjoyed among them, contrasting their own generous reception of us with the animosity of their neighbours. They likewise dwelt upon the cannibal propensities of the Happars, a subject which they were perfectly aware could not fail to alarm us, while at the same time they earnestly disclaimed all the participation in so horrid a custom. Nor did they omit to call upon us to admire the natural loveliness of their own abode, and the lavish abundance with which it produced all manner of luxuriant fruits, exalting it in this particular above any of the surrounding valleys. Kori seemed to experience so heartfelt a desire to infuse into our minds proper views on these subjects that, assisted in his endeavours by the little knowledge of the language we had acquired, he actually made us comprehend a considerable part of what he said. To facilitate our correct apprehensions of his meaning, he at first condensed his ideas into the smallest possible compass. "Hapa, kikino, nui," he exclaimed. "Nui, nui, kiki, kanaka, aol, motaki," which signifies, "Terrible fellows, those Happars, devour an amazing quantity of men. Shocking, bad." Thus far he explained himself by a variety of gestures, during the performance of which he would dart out of the house and point abhorrently towards the Hapa Valley, running into us again with a rapidity that showed he was fearful he would lose one part of his meaning before he could complete the other, and continuing his illustrations by seizing the fleshy part of my arm in his teeth, intimating by the operation that the people who lived over in that direction would like nothing better than to treat me in that manner. Having assured himself that we were fully enlightened on this point, he proceeded to another branch of his subject. Typee, Motaki, Nui, Nui, Miori, Nui, Nui, Wai, Nui, Nui, Poi Poi, Nui, Nui, Koku, Nui, Nui, Ki, Nui, 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 which, literally interpreted as before, would imply, Typee, isn't it a fine place, though? No danger of starving here, I tell you. Plenty of breadfruit, plenty of water, plenty of pudding, plenty of everything, heaps, heaps, heaps. All this was accompanied by a running commentary of signs and gestures which it was impossible not to comprehend. As he continued his harangue, however, Korikori, in emulation of our more polished orators, began to launch out rather diffusely onto other branches of his subject, enlarging probably upon the moral reflections it suggested, and proceeded in such a strain of unintelligible and stunning gibberish that he actually gave me the headache for the rest of the day. Chapter 14. A great event happens in the valley. The Island Telegraph. Something befalls Toby. Fayaway displays a tender heart. Melancholy reflections. Mysterious conduct of the islanders. Devotion of Korikori. A rural couch. A luxury. Korikori strikes a light a la Typee. In the course of a few days, Toby had recovered from the effects of his adventure with the Hapa warriors, the wound on his head rapidly healing under the vegetable treatment of the good Tina. Less fortunate than my companion, however, I still continued to languish under a complaint, the origin and nature of which was still a mystery. Cut off as I was from all intercourse with the civilized world, and feeling the inefficacy of anything the natives could do to relieve me, knowing, too, that so long as I remained in my present condition, it would be impossible for me to leave the valley, whatever opportunity might present itself, and apprehensive that ere long we might be exposed to some caprice on the part of the islanders. I now gave up all hopes of recovery and became a prey to the most gloomy thoughts. A deep dejection fell upon me, which neither the friendly remonstrances of my companion, the devoted attentions of Korikori, nor all the soothing influences of Fayaway could remove. One morning, as I lay on the mats in the house, plunged in melancholy reverie, and regardless of everything around me, Toby, who had left me about an hour, returned in haste, and with great glee told me to cheer up and be of good heart, for he believed, from what was going on among the natives, that there were boats approaching the bay. These tidings operated upon me like magic. The hour of our deliverance was at hand, and starting up, I was soon convinced that something unusual was about to occur. The word "Boti, Boti" was vociferated in all directions, and shouts were heard in the distance, at first feebly and faintly, but growing louder and nearer at each successive repetition, until they were caught up by a fellow in a coconut tree a few yards off, who, sounding them in turn, they were reiterated from a neighbouring grove, and so died away gradually from point to point, as the intelligence penetrated into the farthest recess of the valley. This was the vocal telegraph of the islanders, by means of which condensed items of information could be carried in a very few minutes from the sea to their remotest habitation, a distance of at least 8 or 9 miles. On the present occasion it was in active operation. One piece of information following on another was inconceivably rapidity. The greatest commotion now appeared to prevail. At every fresh item of intelligence, the natives betrayed the liveliest interest, and redoubled the energy with which they employed themselves in collecting fruit to sell to the expected visitors. Some were tearing off the husks from coconuts. Some, perched in the trees, were throwing down breadfruit to their companions, who gathered them into heaps as they fell, while others were plying their fingers rapidly in weaving leafen baskets in which to carry the fruit. There were other matters, too, going on at the same time. Here you would see a stout warrior polishing his spear with a bit of old tapper, or adjusting the folds of the girdle about his waist. And there you might descry a young damsel decorating herself with flowers, as if having in her eye some maidenly conquest, while, as in all cases of hurry and confusion in every part of the world, a number of individuals kept hurrying to and fro, with amazing vigour and perseverance, doing nothing themselves and hindering others. Never before had we seen the islanders in such a state of bustle and excitement, and the scene furnished abundant evidence of the fact that it was only at long intervals any such events occur. When I thought of the length of time that might intervene before a similar chance of escape would be presented, I bitterly lamented that I had not the power of availing myself effectually of the present opportunity. From all that we could gather, it appeared that the natives were fearful of arriving too late upon the beach, unless they made extraordinary exertions. Sick and lame as I was, I would have started with Toby at once, had not Corry not only refused to carry me, but manifested the most invincible repugnance to our leaving the neighbourhood of the house. The rest of the savages were equally opposed to our wishes, and seemed grieved and astonished at the earnestness of my solicitations. I clearly perceived that while my attendant avoided all appearance of constraining my movements, he was nevertheless determined to thwart my wishes. He seemed to me on this particular occasion, as well as often afterwards, to be executing the orders of some other person with regard to me, though at the same time feeling towards me the most lively affection. Toby, who had made up his mind to accompany the islanders if possible, as soon as they were in readiness to depart, and who, for that reason, had refrained from showing the same anxiety that I had done, now represented to me that it was idle for me to entertain the hope of reaching the beach in time to profit by any opportunity that might then be presented. "Do you not see," said he, "the savages themselves are fearful of being too late, and I should hurry forward myself at once. Did I not think that I showed too much eagerness, I should destroy all our hopes of reaping my benefit from this fortunate event. If you will only endeavour to appear tranquil or unconcerned, you will quiet their suspicions, and I have no doubt they will then let me go with them to the beach, supposing that I merely go out of curiosity. Should I succeed in getting down to the boats, I will make known the condition in which I have left you, and measures may then be taken to secure our escape." In the expediency of this I could not but acquiesce, and as the natives had now completed their preparations, I watched with the liveliest interest the reception that Toby's application might meet with. As soon as they understood from my companion that I intended to remain, they appeared to make no objection to his proposition, and even hailed it with pleasure. Their singular conduct on this occasion not a little puzzled me at the time, and imparted to subsequent events an additional mystery. The islanders were now to be seen hurrying along the path which led to the sea. I shook Toby warmly by the hand, and gave him my pater hat to shield his wounded head from the sun, as he had lost his own. He cordially returned the pressure of my hand, and, solemnly promising to return as soon as the boat should leave the shore, sprang from my side, and the next minute disappeared in a turn of the grove. In spite of the unpleasant reflections that crowded upon my mind, I could not but be entertained by the novel and animated sight which by now met my view. One after another the natives crowded along the narrow path, laden with every variety of fruit. Here you might have seen one who, after ineffectually endeavouring to persuade a surly porker to be conducted in leading strings, was obliged at last to seize the perverse animal in his arms and carry him struggling against his naked breast, and squealing without intermission. There went two, who at a little distance might have been taken for the Hebrew spies, on their return to Moses with the goodly bunch of grape. One trotted before the other at a distance of a couple of yards, while between them, from a pole resting on the shoulders, was suspended a huge cluster of bananas, which swayed to and fro with the rocking gait at which they proceeded. Here ran another, perspiring with his exertions, and bearing before him a quantity of coconuts, who, fearful of being too late, heeded not the fruit that dropped from his basket, and appeared solely intent upon reaching his destination, careless how many of his coconuts kept company with him. In a short time the last straggler was seen hurrying on his way, and the faint shouts of those in advance died insensibly upon the ear. Our part of the valley now appeared nearly deserted by its inhabitants. Corry, his aged father, and a few decrepit old people being all that were left. Towards sunset, the islanders, in small parties, began to return from the beach, and among them, as they drew near to the house, I sought to descry the form of my companion. But one after another they passed the dwelling, and I caught no glimpse of him. Supposing, however, that he would soon appear with some of the members of the household, I quieted my apprehensions, and waited patiently to see him advancing in company with the beautiful Fayaway. At last I perceived Tina coming forward, followed by the girls and young men who usually resided in the house of Maheo. But with them came not my comrade, and, filled with 1,000 alarms, I eagerly sought to discover the cause of his delay. My earnest questions appeared to embarrass the natives greatly. All their accounts were contradictory, one giving me to understand that Toby would be with me in a very short time, another that he did not know where he was, while a third, violently inveighing against him, assured me that he had stolen away, and would never come back. It appeared to me, at the time, that in making these various statements they endeavoured to conceal from me some